Welcome to Wickerson Studios. It's Sunday, the 17th of January, 2021, and I am continuing with my Wickerson Studio compiled plugins. If you find them interesting, and I'll try and show you what each one does as we go through it. I turn these all to disable, put this back over to shaded, and jump into our first script, which is fairly easy. And you'll see that not only have I compiled a series of meshes, if I click on here, that are controlled. It's best to follow a mesh surface on this one. You have an awful lot of control in a node that I call point mesh 001. And you can not only change the scale of that on the X and Y direction, you can change the stretch. I call it a probability, but it literally keeps you scaling within a reasonable number. Probabilities people should know to go between 0 and 1 with small decimal places. The probability of, the low percentage and high percentage is something that you can play off the surface edit of these meshes and how far they go up. That works in high and low probability to build some very interesting forms. You don't have to have such a huge count. You can take this right down and deal with a geometry that's actually pretty manageable. Just make sure that you bring that the factors down so they're not so crazy up in the air. I'm going to bring that right down low, and you can see that you can play off of some pretty interesting structures. So, it is producing points. That's mainly what it does. And then I have an A, B, and C factor, which allows you to jump and jostle and change everything and play with certain points that override. And it really is just a conditional nested, I believe if you go in here, you'll see the script. And it is, it's just conditional if things hold between certain averages. You can go in and play with this and change it. And I would really recommend at this point in making your own nodes. And I did customize one, which I kind of liked, and it's down here. There it is. It's a pretty nice surface edit, and it's just something I can play with. And I've got it. I've got a dividing factor on there as well, as long as you don't go to 0, because it'll fudge out on you. So it's probably good to take at least your numbers minimal into certain ranges that actually are decent, so you don't go to the red and bust your script. But point fields, how to control them, how to make for different structures, how to have fun with that. Take your count down if you want. If you want to keep things in the same XY direction, you can just bring it down like that. And you're left with a little surface point there. Kind of a nice form, to draped form, following meshes and just playing with data. That's it. You will find a way to understand this more and more. So that, once again, was my first Wickerson Studio Point Mesh 001, and that will probably be in the mesh tools. Even though most of these are all point generations, and then I take it into meshes or into curves or into surfaces or into panels. I am recommending those within that list that they're best suited for those things. So that's 11, and I know we went through a whole series of other ones. What's this one? This is going to be this will be a trig function, which I showed yesterday on a video, and I'm very excited about this trig function and how it runs. Let's take it to enable. Very nice, simple surface, and we don't have to. I've taken it to a network surfaces. And I did some jazz afterwards just to make it a little more fun. But if we just took a look at what it was this point outcome and this surface created from it. It's not too hard in your XYZ direction. That should make sense in your height to what you want to do. Choosing cosine and sine, it's not too complex. But what I find is putting that over to a mesh is always interesting. And certainly taking the surface and deep-repping it, finding the edges. And what I did there was I took the complex sides of what was happening, curves A and B, and found the in-between curve, and I decided using network surfaces to really manipulate that. So even though I'm stuck with the X and Y's, this is more of a grasshopper tool, which I haven't found a way to code into the GH Python script. But like I said, I really believe the basics of point outputs are what the Wickerson Studio nodes are about, and I'll say that again. The Wickerson Studio points are about producing point clouds. What you do with them to curves, meshes, surfaces, breps is your business, and how you manipulate them afterwards still relies on a heavy skill set within Grasshopper. But I really like what I did with that using other functions. And actually, I have enough functions within C that I brought in that I probably could find a tween curve and vary this. But since there is a nice tween curve function without going into too many plugins, I'm not one to find plugins. I like to kind of customize the nodes GHPython and C to do what I want. So that one, once again, is a trig surface 001. It's probably tucked into the maths. If I go back into Wickerson Studios, you'll probably find that's under the that's the trigonometric function 01, because this one's moving towards a surface. It might be a trig function there that I put into a surface, because it really does generate a nice surface. And once you learn how to manipulate that and play with that and do things with it, you'll have a lot of fun. Boy, I really like that subtlety. I mean, these are like rippling, throwing tons of pebbles in a pond and being able to capture all that. So hopefully people are into the math. Then you're in the Wickerson Studios and you're into basic programming in Python and maybe some C. Those are the followers that I'm looking for. Let's go to the next one, which was actually I buried this one. This is the trigonometric function that I did bury, and it has enumerated in it all the math functions that I like to use with similar x, y, z. So I can enumerate through on these steps. I can enumerate through what the different functions do to that surface, going through sine, cosine, tangent, logarithm, and things like this. So I'll leave that up to you to play with. I'm not going to break that down into the math, and I'm not going to distribute that because that's one of the first Wickerson Studio trigonometric functions that I'm going to make and call my own. If you really want to see the breakdown of that, you can, but it's not too hard for those that are interested in the math that's behind it. Let's take that to disable. That's the most exciting one I'd say on here, the trigonometric function 001, and it's in the math tool. And I think what I'm going to do is really focus in on what Wickerson Studios can do with mathematics to generate geometries. And I just lost my form. Let's go to the next one. And this one is a probability mesh from points. And what we can do is turn that one on, and we'll enable it. And you can see right here, we don't need to be seeing anything but the cloud cluster. And what it does is it divides from the script that's within it a mid and low probability of grabbing this series of points, this series of points, and this series of points from the 100 that are there. Well, actually, there's tons. So let's just grab like 94, and you'll see this one has chosen 35 of those points. This one's chosen 29 of those points, and this one's chosen 30 of those points. So you really are just drawing up different meshes as a probability as what will come out as you control how much you want. And if you go to a certain level, you'll turn one red because there'll be no chance of having any points in that mesh. So it's just a kind of a mesh jitter to have some control over it mathematically. And the script itself is, once again, very conditional and based on the for and else if and else statements. So there's not the hardest scripts in the world to figure out. That one I'm not so excited about, but I thought I'd put it in there anyway. 15 is pretty interesting. Let's grab this one and see what's going on here. And I've done some pre and post, actually mostly pre script. So I've grabbed myself some points here. I call it the primitive curve attractor, and it's very specific. And at this point, your scripts get too complex that you end up bringing in, you can see there's a bunch of squares that are brought in. And what's weird is I took a 3D populated and I projected it down. I guess the best thing I could have done was just gone in and grabbed myself a 2D and then just taken those points 100 and shot that right in. That would have been totally fine, except for that strange thing I did. So I'm going to leave that as an option for you guys to play with. Just have some fun with that, whichever one you want to do. I'm just going to leave it in there like that. With those points, I have an attractor point that can be played with and changed. And in changing that, it moves up and down, which is an interesting direction for it. But in doing so, you can see it has an attractor point on the spheres. It controls how far away it is. So there's two geometries, rectangles and radius of the spheres playing in here to produce circles and squares. And of course, there's a probability of, well, you can change the size and scale of the squares, which actually isn't hooked into the attractor point. So you can go back into the script and try and figure out how to do that. But my node system, it's so specific to geometry. These are the type of nodes that I'm going to shy away from being too particular, because what would you do with something like this that produces circles and squares of different sizes and dimensions? Like, there's no real point to do that. If you want to play with your vector and pull the one up so it actually lifts in the air, I guess you can do that as well. Anyhow, it's up to you to kind of have a way. Yeah, I can lift it up and play off the vector here, and I can move it in different directions. But it's so specific that if I took that point cloud all the way down, and I did lift some, and I did have a close count on maybe 12 curves here and 14 curves here, I guess I could start to grab tools like the loft and say, let's loft all these list of items to holding down shift these list of items. But you can see there you're going to have to get into loft options and align to what you're doing, and then maybe you'll get lucky with some points. And I probably will have to grab one of these to make it work, or actually grab both of them to make it work. There we go. So you start building some geometries, understanding what can happen. But once again, who's going to build this strange cityscape and for what reason. But circles to squares is kind of interesting. But that's just the loft tool doing that. This node is kind of so particular, it's kind of useless. So I'm going to avoid doing things like that. You should be creating your own kind of nodes if that's what you want to do. Let's go down into 16, which could be interesting. I'm not sure. I'm showing the Wickerson Studio compiled scripts, even though above are the user objects, the preparation for the user objects. This one's actually a pretty nice one, pretty simple. So you got a point counter on a 2D plane, and you could always jazz that up by going to 3D surface. But I've also got a shift and a probability and a threshold. So what I'm generating are these line-like curves that are pretty interesting if you take a look, that I can produce more or less of them. They basically say, how far away do I want to build this little tripod area? Do I want to drop or do I want to lower that? And the probability is lowering it right now, but you could turn this to negative and you can change your number sliders to be anything you want. But that was kind of nice. And then I've got a shift, which allows me to move that up. So technically, I can grab this one and I can grab this one. I can move it in either way that I want. And I guess afterwards, after producing those cluster-like lines, which are fairly interesting, let's take the count right down to, you'll see that if I take the count down to 29, I'm only now starting to get a set of 3 curves that come together. So that's a very interesting logic that's in that math to create this. But once in a while, it's kind of like these spiderweb kind of monster creation things that are, you can think of that as animations and as constructions, but it really is the power of using programming within it. The script itself is not too hard. Jumping in here, there's for the count, there's a couple of conditionals, but basically it's just running through list, I believe, list items. Yeah, everything's coming as list access, and you're using a float threshold. So not too hard to figure out. But once again, it's getting a little too specific. Who's going to want to make something like that? Maybe you want to make something like it, but not have it exactly made. Now, cannot compile to get these outputs to work. This made me crazy that every time I ran this and I enabled this, it was very nice. It would take 2 curves, no matter what they were, and it would divide them up and then find the closest points between them. So it would find the points on those 2 curves. You can see the curves. You can find the points on them as you divide them. And it should be coming up on both curves, but it's not. It should be dividing both. I'm not sure why visually I'm having trouble with the visuals. And then it should connect the lines between them as the closest points. And that's how the script's supposed to run. So you're supposed to run it and be able to do that because there's strange kind of data within that script. I could not compile it down here, and everything I was doing, no matter what I did, kept compiling in a way that oh my gosh, don't tell me it's going to work now. It looks like it actually is compiling correctly now. There might have been a slight shift. I'm finding that there are some things you have to pay a lot of attention to, like where exactly this return, which loop this return is fed into. If you take this data and you start playing with the return value and shifting back your tab, you're going to find that really makes an effect on your script. And that's the kind of thing that scripting, you've got to get your head around. And I can't believe this is actually working now because it was not working for the longest time. I've got 11 items in between. Might have been that I just had to reload it. But that's very interesting that script's actually working. Unless, of course, this is my user object script. Yes, it is. It's not a compiled script. So I've taken it and produced the grasshopper component. But as soon as I take it to compile, it fails. It's working as a user object, but not working as a compile script. I'm running into problems with that. And obviously, I have to look a little more into compiling more complex scripts as I write them. And I'll figure that out. It'll just take another week, hopefully. Let's disable that one. And that's a pretty common, tool to divide and join lines between. So you might want to make a script like that. You might want to use that one. 18 is pretty interesting. Let's go into here and enable and say this is geometry on intersections. So it's pretty custom, so you don't really have to use it, but I played a little bit with the pre-thing so I can make these little butterflies. I think they're nice that kind of flutter and move their wings and move back and forth on the intersections of whatever curves and points you make. And you can also have the control over the size and scale of them. So I called that a factor width, factor height, which will play with that. And I also took a positive, negative in here. And what you're actually outputting is like a point system. That's it. And surfaces that you've created on top. So I'm actually starting to get into a script that is starting to build. If you take a look in here, you're starting to use your vector point 3Ds, adding surface to the point, building tangents. You're actually starting to write a little more in Rhino Common, and you're moving away from Rhino syntax, and you're moving into Rhino geometry. So that's exciting to make that progression. Soon we're going to be in the tree data, and we're going to be moving out of lists, because you'll see a lot of these are coming in as list items. You can tell by the fancy wires. So let's take that off disable. 19, let's see which one popped in here. This is enable, and that's a surface that comes in. We don't need to look at that surface. We will look at this panel and what happens to it. I'm not sure why it's so boring. That's the surface that I'm interested in using. My surface is totally being a dud. That's strange over here. Let me, I mean, it's processing. Well, I thought it was. Let me see what's happening. Maybe the surface is, no, that's the surface. Something dudded out on that one. I'll have to check into that. Let's take that to disable. Let's go back over to this one and run it as a Python script before I try to compile it. There it is. So what I've done is I've made this surface that if you set these numbers right at 1 and 1, you'll see you really are panelizing just a surface you inputted at a certain count. And that's kind of fun. But what I like to do is I like to step in directions. So I always add from a hard-coded step that if I was fabricating this and I actually wanted the panels to go 2, they're actually overlapping. They're actually not fitting. They become kind of gilled. Maybe that example is not so good in that direction. This is a little better in this direction. You can see how it starts to flash out and you make an interesting kind of structure. And I like this shifting, and I actually set my number sliders to go negative as well. And it kind of is exponential as it walks off the side of these surfaces. It doesn't know where to go. And I find that's a very interesting, cool treat to what actually happens. But you got to keep your numbers kind of low. So if I set it at 2 and 2, you see it says interesting kind of flashing panel. Not sure why this one enabling is running my script flat. Something happened in the compiling, and I am running into some compiling errors, maybe because they're dependent on certain components. But I could always turn that into a if it doesn't process fully in the compiling, I could always go to this as a making a user object and tucking it into there, and then I'd have it available to me with the Wickerson logo. It's not hard to make but it's when you compile for open source or something on Grasshopper or Rhino, Food for Rhino, you're going to have to learn that these single item scripts and simple scripts are easy to compile. I haven't gotten into the more complex compiling yet. Like I said, I'll have to do that. That's the best thing about learning, is you realize you have to kind of keep reading and learning what's going on. And this is once again the paneling tool, and I put this in the red, not so much that it does compile and have a problem with compiling, but because the script is so particular, enabling this and making these incredible things and starting to play with numbers and having an effect on this, that's just one side to have an effect on opening and closing it as the panel goes. So there's no real point, in me showing that I want one side of those triangles to be manageable to open and close, or I can flatten it up. Like, the data in here is so hard-coded in so many areas with these digits that all I've done is put in a high probability and low probability wherever I saw a 0.1 or a 0.9. But you see all these other numbers to hard-code. And I could go with a large paneling series of examples, but that's kind of futile. I mean, what's the point of me finding a panel that I like to do on a surface when all you have to do is have the basic level of what's happening and go in and learn how to script? So at this point, I don't think it's worth compiling these geometries because there's so much about play and finding your own work. Anyway, I will continue. I am very excited to where after paneling we will get into, I believe, after the paneling series, we'll get into inputs and we'll start playing with tree data. So a few examples of paneling I'm going to do from maybe 20 to 25, and then I'm going to get into actually starting to process what I input types as trees and tree access, so points with tree access. And that's where you're going to start to really gain control of paths and geometries and not have to deal with everything as a point unit or as a point list. Anyway, should be fun. I'm excited about it. Let's just take that, put it to enable, and show you the chaos of what actually gets generated fairly quickly. There's a few algorithms, but like I said, the algorithms get too complex and specific to what I want to do or what's already online. you're going to want to customize everything to be what you need it to be. So yeah, maybe I'll just click that on. There we go. Click a few that'll just make it blue in areas. All right, thanks again for watching. Wickerson Studios, 17th of January, 2021.